Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on fusion energy. We have our world famous speaker, Professor David J. Kelly. So Professor David J. Kelly, you are a researcher, you are an innovator, and you work with artificial intelligence. If you share your views about energy, especially fusion energy, uh, it will be helpful for our emerging economy audience.
Sure. Well, uh, energy is really kind of the solution to a lot of different problems, whether it's oil or electricity or there's a lot of different areas related to energy, and I think one of the big trends right now is moving away from uh, like oil to renewable energies. Um, Personally, I tend to think that the best kind of renewable energy is probably nuclear, although I'm not an expert, but I do have a son that's a nuclear researcher, um, and from him, I tend to think um, uh, we need to get into to probably thorium reactors that have a much don't produce as much bad way or really dangerous waste. And then but I don't think that there's one solution to the problem. I think in the future it'll be built on multiple kinds of energy, and but probably solar and nuclear being the top ones. um,
Mhm.
Wind, there's other different kinds of sources of renewable energy, but a lot of them are have limitations or issues, um, whereas uh, um, solar and nuclear both I think are things we'll see in the future, in part because there's an unlimited amount of solar energy almost for all intents and purposes if we know how to catch it, um, which tends to be the trick actually. But uh, um, I think that's
Mhm.
that's what we have to figure out is how to move away from burning oil and coal and all of this other stuff that's messing up the planet to things that are more efficient or consistent and lowering the cost of that. And a lot of that's just going to be market forces. I don't really believe a lot of this stuff should be mandated, but at some point, um, I think there are market reasons for why nuclear and solar are going to be our best choices.
Mhm. Okay. Like we love to learn more about U.S. Uh, energy policy. So, do you have any idea, or you want to share your uh, like experience about U.S. energy policy, or how does it work? How they focus on green technology or green energy?
Well, I think it's all over the map. I think one of the things people need to understand, and I don't think even people in the US really understand, that the United States is effectively 50 different countries, and each state within that is has different policies. There is federal policy, which is kind of your overarching thing, but the individual states operate as their own country in a lot of ways. They make up their own laws, their own borders. There's all kinds of different things run at that level, and they tend to have different uh, different policies. Like I live in Washington State, and Washington State, that used to have a love affair with nuclear, and there was this whole, they used to call it whoops, but it was just a whole string of letters. Uh, but essentially, it was a program where they were building reactors all over the state, and then midway through, everyone was panicking about the radiation meltdown, so they wasted all this money, and then uh, since then they've raised, we continue to raise uh, costs on gas or fossil fuels as a matter of policy in the state, um, instead of encouraging other ways of doing things. Um, I've known in some locales, not in Washington State, but um, other states, where they actually punish people essentially for using solar energy. Because the power company doesn't want to deal with it. Is where other people are encouraged to do it, and um, they at least part of the year are able to uh, make more money than what they're paying, because the power company will pay them for whatever excess electricity they're able to put back on the grid. Um, and so it's really kind of all over the map. I think, like in Washington, it's a pretty liberal state, so you have a lot of pro-green sorts of technologies, but or programs, policies, but it's inconsistent. Um, and then there's conflicting policy. Like Washington State, for example, has an overabundance of hydroelectric power, which is very clean. Um, but it is kind of a localized thing. You can't just put massive hydroelectric programs all over the world, because you know you're in the middle of the Sahara Desert or the Mojave Desert, or up in one of these you just don't have the resources to, um, you just can't put big hydroelectric plants. Now in Washington State there's a conflict between, the traditional thing in Washington State with green energy through hydroelectric power, and a lot of environmentalists that want to tear down all the dams. Uh, uh, and the problem is, if you tear down all the dams, then a lot of this free energy, low cost renewable energy that Washington State has is going to go away. And people seem to not be registering that all the way. And so it's really hard to predict where that'll go, especially because I'm not really an expert. Like I said, when it comes to nuclear, I have a son that is an expert. Uh, he's actually a published research scientist in nuclear physics, and but I just, either in energy or uh, nuclear physics, I'm just not an expert. Um, even on the policy side, my
Mhm.
my my expertise, is more on the AI.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, great. Uh, I like USA actually has a lot of innovation for energy sectors, and the major players from USA, they are also playing role around the world. And recently, we see that because of the Ukraine and Russia war, the energy price increase and energy uh, become a big challenges for uh, the country like Bangladesh and this kind of countries. So, what do you think? What is the impact of this war, and how we can resolve this challenging situation?
Well, I don't really like to get too political, given our research in e-governance, because I don't want to be seen as favoring one side or the other. But within the whole liberal versus conservative sort of spectrum. But with Ukraine, I am completely on the Ukrainian side. There is the war in Ukraine. Russia's choice to invade has caused a lot of problems, especially in the energy sector, with regard to oil and heating and energy production in Europe, because over this whole thing with the war. And I think, at least in Europe, it'll just kind of force kind of the green sustainable agenda a long ways, just because they don't really have a choice. Ukraine obviously is facing a lot of energy problems because Russia keeps targeting, just like last night or the last 24 hours, Russia did another missile campaign targeted towards civilian infrastructure. And I think while it's just horrifying that they keep doing this, at the same time, I do think that it could be an impetus for Ukraine to move away from centralized power to more of a decentralized grid, which I think in the long run is the future. And I think, in that way, Ukraine might be able to make it sort of take advantage of the situation, to encourage kind of a decentralized, instead of repairing the grid back to the way it was, repair their grid to a more decentralized sort of system that's much more robust. Like in the United States, if someone conducted a missile campaign like that, you'd probably have the whole continent black for like 6 months, because how fragile some of our systems are. I hope that they can take advantage of that in that regard. But we've got to see this war over as soon as possible. And I like I said, I try to stay out of commenting on politics, but I really am opposed to Russia's invasion.
Mr. David Smith, can you hear me? Mr. David Smith?
I can.
Okay, we are discussing about fusion
Sharif,
energy.
I apologize for the delay in traffic. You can never anticipate when Rex would. We could solve that problem. We would solve a lot of the problems in the world. But energy is one that has just picked up so much speed and dynamics in the last year. It was towards the end of last year when, for the first time ever, we were able to see that a fusion reaction has generated more energy than it absorbed by the and this was really a critical milestone on the way to us achieving self-sustained nuclear fusion. And this was back last August, where Lawrence Livermore National Lab achieved a yield of more than 1.3 megajoules. And it really was enabled by focusing laser lights that were about the size of 3 football fields onto a target about the size of a BB to produce that type of energy. And it's a real advancement for science in that. But what was happening is that this is a concept of fusion that is, like many people say, similar to what you see on the sun. But it was really first proposed back in the early, I believe it was the 1920s, uh, when a British physicist proposed that the sun and stars were powered by the fusion of hydrogen into helium. And that really pushed the idea very forward. Now, some of these early predictions and things were off base, and we've heard for decades and decades that a fusion reactor is in the next 10 years or so. But we're beginning to see that reality is a lot closer than we ever thought before. Uh, in just the last few weeks, there have been some other fairly significant breakthroughs in fusion energy. And what I believe you're going to be seeing is we're going to see um, fusion energy sources beginning to use in demonstration projects and things within the next 5 years, which I can't believe I'm saying that, but it really is there. And we'll see commercial production probably in 10 years, which is a very big one. I first was involved in looking at fusion reactors back when I was a student decades and decades ago at the University of Texas at Austin, uh, where they created what is called a tomac reactor. And a tomac is a vacuum chamber surrounded by intense magnets and that work to combine plasma to create inside that magnet field to do fusion. And those were some of the early ways to get to it. And you're seeing now that there's new ways to do things like that, like kind of squeezing water in a balloon. You see other ways for confinement and tremendous advances in material science. And particularly when you look at some of the um, materials and alloys and even liquid surfaces that are required to make fusion happen on a way that can be used commercially. Uh, the other thing that you can begin to see with this is that the new materials, particularly the ability to breed titanium and diarium, which are two of the really important chemicals used in fusion, and how they're going. You also see that there are now projects being put into place all around the world trying to advance fusion. And we're now seeing fusion companies coming to commercialize the technology. And there's companies all around the world beginning to do this. And fusion is very interesting because it's clean. It is a source that can last for a long, long time, and it's really important to understand that some of the timelines, the nuclear power plants that we have now, uh, was not until the mid 1960s that you begin to see those. And now you're going to see the same type of things with fusion power coming out. And it's worth noting that if you look at the nuclear plants that are in existence today, most of their licenses are expiring before the 2040s, 2050s, which is a target date for net zero carbon emissions. And they're one of the leading places for generating that today. And so fusion power probably has a place to help be the replacement for fission power and actually for a lot of the polluting energy sources we have in our grid today. So, Sharif, I hope that helps.
Thank you, Professor David J. Kelly. Mr. David.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So right now, energy become the biggest challenge, and only because of that, price inflations and everything going up and up. So, as a scientist, I know that you are not energy expert, but as a scientist, what is your advice for emerging economy? How they can overcome from this challenging situation?
Well, I think they can start by not being afraid of nuclear power. I think, with some of the potential developments in nuclear power, I think it really has the potential. Well, like I said earlier, when it comes to green energy, in the long run, I think it's nuclear power and solar. Everything else has localized problematic issues that um, just make them kind of either inconsistent or highly localized. Uh, and um, Nuclear is the way to go. And I think
Uh,
another thing is, I don't think people should be, if you're interested in it, you know do something. I know of, like, I have a son that's a published nuclear scientist, but you know they built a reactor in high school in the basement, and figured out how to make it work, and they were able to get all the licenses and other stuff, uh, and and it's not that hard. Now, like, the reactor they built is never going to produce any power. You if you They did an experiment to generate power with it, and uh, they it took like 8 megawatts to get like 12 volts out of it. It's not something you could produce power with it, but uh, you can learn, and you can uh, become an expert, and I think potentially there's careers there for people.
uh, Professor David Smith, what's your view?
Well, I agree. There's going to be more and more careers in this. Nuclear fission, which is what the power plants are today, is a great stepping stone for us to get to nuclear fusion. And they're different processes. Nuclear fission produces a lot of decayed material and other things, which are challenges for us to deal with and are very volatile. Where nuclear fusion has some other advantages in there, in that, number one, nuclear fusion doesn't create that harmful waste we were just talking about. And nuclear fission produces all the radiative byproducts that last for thousands of years. Where nuclear fusion, the only byproduct of it is the creation of helium as a byproduct. And it won't create the same environmental damages that, for example, that either the nuclear waste does or that fossil fuels create. So it has some very positive things for the environment. Uh, there's also almost an infinite supply of fuel for nuclear fusion. The main ingredient in nuclear fusion is deuterium, which is distilled from ocean water. And every other component of the process is easily found or made. And so you see a energy source that doesn't deplete a lot of the other environmental resources for the planet. Um, and if the promise of the abilities to create nuclear fusion at scale are met, it should be horribly inexpensive. Um, some of the scientists estimate it's going to be 0.03 cents per kilowatt. So again, a very low cost way of begin doing it. And It's also, particularly compared to fossil fuels, even windmills, and particularly nuclear fission, it's a low risk form of energy. You know, if I'm in a classic nuclear reactor today using nuclear fission, you're splitting atoms that create a chance of a dangerous chain reaction occurring, much like what we saw in Chernobyl when we had the meltdown there. And you see that fish fossil fuels create problems for their production, and they can have a negative impact on personal health. Nuclear fusion is really easy to control, and it's also much safer than almost any form of our energy production. I live in Texas in the United States, and our windmill farms kill thousands and thousands of birds and things every year. And we've actually in the United States had numbers of small airplanes, particularly at night, flying low, going through fields where windmills were generating power, be struck and crashed. So you see that's on there. The other thing about fusion is when you look at the targets coming out of the UN COP process and everything, uh, global warming can begin to be solved without energy loss. Helium, the byproduct of fusion, is not one of the greenhouse gases that we believe are contributing to changing weather cycles. And that means the planet can begin to heal itself. And we have a very powerful uh, energy source going forward. We've began to uh, deal with some of the disadvantages. The announcement last year about being able to generate more energy than the energy required to create the process is a huge breakthrough. Uh, but we need to also create the infrastructure for nuclear fusion. It's a different infrastructure, and it will be one that the first ones are going to be fairly expensive as we go. We're seeing promises now for small scale fusion reactors, which will probably change that. Um, you know, fusion might have some unintended consequences. It's a very powerful source. If we look at how our sun produces energy, it's a similar process, and we don't know what it will happen with it. You know, we also need to understand what are the other applications we can use with the helium. Some scientists today are looking at being able to take helium like that and use that as a substitute for some of the other materials for producing batteries and battery storage and other things like that. So there's a lot of science to be done with that. The other thing is that with all these breakthroughs, there's still a lot of innovation that needs to be done. And particularly in material science and the control systems and how we can work to control these materials as we bring them to the market. There's also a tremendous amount of confusion in the marketplace. When you say nuclear fusion, most people confuse that with nuclear fission, which is the process we have in nuclear power plants today, and which is the process that has made nuclear bombs. Nuclear fusion is a totally different process in how it generates the energy. The materials it takes to generate the energy are totally different. And and so that perception of them is one of the big things that the industry has to grapple with. Plus the fact that nuclear fusion is one that, as we look at it, it can be done in environments where uh, fossil fuel production, solar, wind power, and others cannot be done. The only other competitor I see that is coming to the marketplace to help us produce energy that is clean and others like that is using hydrogen to produce energy. And I think hydrogen is another wild card we have to look at as we look at the future of power and energy. But fusion, I think, is one of the leading criterias to take us towards the end of this century into the next century is a clean, dependable energy system. And the advances in science are so promising right now that I'm very bullish on it.
Mr. David Kelly.
Well, a
Mr. David
couple.
J. Kelly, if you share some of your views. Yeah. Sure, please continue.
Oh, okay. So I mean, a couple of points with the deuterium tritium reaction. I think it's important that people understand that deuterium is a function, is a form of hydrogen, and while that's pretty straightforward, they also that same reaction also requires another fuel, tritium, and tritium is a lot harder to get. We're going to have to make it. Now, I've seen like a tabletop reactor that can make tritium, but as far as I know, that's in general, they're using, most tritium comes from fission reactors that make it at scale as a byproduct. And the other thing is like, again, just going back to the reactors that my son made in high school, those reactors, when they do deuterium tritium reactions to create fusion, while the byproduct is not very radioactive, the radiation output during the reaction is extremely high. Now, in the case of this tabletop reactor, they were using a fusor reactor with tritium and deuterium. That reactor, even with a 5-ton block of lead over the top, they couldn't run the reactor at full strength because of the amount of radiation that would come out of that reaction. You know, there's a lot of research that needs to be done, you know, to be able to get a small reactor like that to make power cleanly and not kill everything within a mile. Whereas, you know, these initial fusion reactors using laser are able to I think is really what we're going to see in the next 10 years, but they're still relatively huge. And then we've got to figure out better ways of manufacturing tritium, either with fusor reactors or that sort of thing, but hopefully moving away from fission reactors. Anyway.
So David Smith.
David, you're 100% correct on tritium. And what's interesting to me is that there are multiple alternative approaches in early stage, moderate stages of science now looking at generate that. But the other thing that really, David, I think is the breakthrough of this one is, as opposed to some of the earlier approaches using some of the tomac reactors and things that we used before, this new example out of Lawrence Livermore lab used high power, very precise lasers to be the source to contain the fusion reaction. So instead of using very large magnets, which required high temperature superconductivity materials and things, they began to look at other sources like these lasers to begin to control it. And the other thing that happened during some of those advances there is they looked at how to make tremendous improvements in the shell they used that was built on helium to be the shell around the reaction. And that really helped to accelerate this too, because of its ability to contain it without all of the high temperature superconducting materials and things that were required in the past. Also, the improved laser precision and the ability to co-mingle laser beams to create a stronger field was one of the big breakthroughs in this. And there also were some tremendous design changes in the ones at Lawrence Livermore Lab, which looked at how to increase the energy coupled to the implosion and how to compress that implosion even more. And that is really, again, a thing that it lets us begin to move this closer to a commercialization process. And see the difference we've seen is really back in the late 1880s, 1980s, but early 1990s, a project began for the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, which is a fusion reactor. Um, they began launching it into 2007 in design stage, but they didn't begin construction of it until I think it was around 2012, 2013 to build it. And this was one that is built on older technology from that time period. The one that Lawrence Livermore Lab built and that MIT has also built is one that's called the SPARC Spark Project. And it is one that is using all the lasers, and it is beginning to be one where the containment fields on this is going to be tremendously stronger than what you saw with the old ITER ones. You're going to see them, I think it's like 20, 25 Teslas compared to about 10 as you begin to see from the others. And much smaller in diameter. So you're seeing these begin to be moved to where you can take this from a lab experiment and move it to a proof of concept and then move it into commercialization. The I love that your son David was able to construct a small scale reactor. What most of the general public doesn't realize is most of the satellites we send to space, deep space, and things are powered not by solar cells on the outside, but they're powered by a combination of decaying radioactive materials and a fuel cell converting hydrogen into energy. And that you see these. So if you look between those, that is a model that can be used in small scale locations to generate energy. And the future of the fusion reactor is kind of modeled after that, where you will have a fusion reactor that can actually drop in place where our existing fossil fuel power generation facilities are, and actually use the same infrastructure. Fusion reactors can be used to generate heat to make steam to drive turbines, much like you see today with coal, natural gas, and with oil to generate the heat to power the steam to generate energy. So you don't have to create a lot of new infrastructure as we transition to fusion power in the future. It can be a drop-in replacement even. But I think we're going to see increased miniaturization of fusion reactors where it can be used as a place to power microgrids and mini grids to begin to do a precision power approach too, much like what we're doing on our deep space satellites of today. So, Sharif, I think those are some of the very, very interesting promises we see of this going forward.
Thank you. Mr. David Jekali.
Well, I would like to see fusion reactors miniaturized enough where they could replace those radioisotope batteries that a lot of the spacecraft are using. The problem with those radioisotope batteries is they're using like plutonium, which is super dangerous. And even after the thing runs dead after 40, 50, 60, or 100 years, it's still super dangerous. It's in terms of nuclear waste. And that's why NASA and the government and so forth generally have not used radioisotope batteries on stuff on Earth, because they're just, well, super radioactive. But they're for deep space missions, like the big rovers on Mars are using radioisotope batteries. Voyager 1, Voyager 2, a number of the other probes. It's a great technology, but I think the smaller fusion reactors, if they can get it practical, I think that's really where the future is with nuclear power.
David, I agree with you, and I almost prefer to talk about fusion without attaching the nuclear power in front of it, because the processes are so very, very different. And yes, there's going to be interchanges with them. But what's interesting is if I go back and look at some of the market reports on this, the fusion energy market is expected to reach almost $900 billion by 2035. So that kind of tells us is that we're seeing the need for this going forward, and they believe it's going to be successful with those type of number projections. And we all know that there's a growing demand for electricity going forward, because not only are we the population increasing, we're seeing urbanization, but we're seeing increased need for things like electric vehicles. Their power requirements is driving it. We're seeing other things where the electricity utilization is be going up, so we have to do things to be able to increase our output, all the while trying to go more green as we get there. And we will see that happening. If I look at Allied Market research, which is looking at the fusion engineering market, they expect almost $500 billion by 2030 in this marketplace, and they can see the segmentation really growing, particularly when you look at the targets that have come out of the United Nations top process and how to begin to go that way. Yes, the largest market share is going to some of the fusion reactions that they believe based on deuterium, but we're seeing others going using other materials now and some of the other science, such as photon boron and some of the helium-3 and other technologies like that. But you see a lot of companies playing in this marketplace globally, from almost every continent, looking at, and large companies and small ones. And you're going to see that market really together. And it has the ability, it has no long-lived radioactive waste and almost no CO2 emissions at all. And you'll begin to see it moving beyond it. You're also seeing, like I said earlier, this whole concept of laser ignited initiatives, like what was done at Lawrence Livermore Lab. And you're seeing work done across all of the different types of concepts. And David, I'm with some of the work I'm doing with NASA right now, I've seen some visibility into one of their projects called VISTA, which is Vehicle for Interplanetary Space Transport Applications. And it is beginning to look at how to use small fusion reactors as a replacement for some of the other energy systems. And I think projects like that are going to help accelerate the movement towards this type of change as we go forward. And as I came out, and again, I apologize for being stuck in traffic. the 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 energy crisis we see as a result of the pandemic with the breakdown in logistics systems, the energy shortages we see as a result of Russia invading the Ukraine and the war that has ensued there for over the last year. Uh, those are all things to highlight the need for us to look beyond classic fossil fuels and to look beyond some of the challenges we have even with uh, fission as we go towards producing fusion reactors. Those are some of the real things I think are going to be um, critical for the success in this marketplace. The other thing I do want to say is that I believe in the future we will have a hybrid set of energy sources. We will see geothermal as a major player in the future of energy production. I believe we're going to see hydrogen and hydrogen production, much like we see in fuel cells today, is a major player. Yes, we will continue to see solar. We will continue to see wind. We will also begin to see more kinetic energy generation. I love one of the startup companies I visited with last year, who is using the kinetic motion of trains to generate power and storing that in batteries in the train. And then when they pull through cities, dropping those batteries off and substituting them into motion to generate. Trying to take and take components of salt water and take out of salt water to generate energy as well. So there's a lot of science, a lot of entrepreneurship work being done around the whole concept of how to generate energy that can be used, particularly energy that's clean. But I believe that fusion reactors will be a large part of that when we see how to produce power at scale that is needed to be used across the global environment. And Sharif, that's kind of, as wearing my futurist hat, that's kind of where I see this going. It will be that hybrid solution.
Thank you. Professor David J. Kelly, what's your concluding remarks?
I'm sorry?
What's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I think in summary, if people are interested in this stuff, they should get involved. And I think the future is definitely nuclear and solar more than anything else, at least especially in the long run. Other than localized solutions for different things, and I would actually almost argue that nuclear and solar is probably companies coming out with good ideas that are workable are probably going to be some good investments. Don't quote me on that, but I think I'll be approaching it from that standpoint. Anyway, yeah, that's it. Future is nuclear and solar.
Sharif, would you like my concluding remarks? They go along actually a bit broader than what David said. I think nuclear has a place in the future.
Professor David is
Vision. I think solar has a place. I think geothermal is going to take an increasing larger market share on the future of energy. Uh, I believe we're going to see some of these alternative approaches begin to take into account more. I am concerned about some of the byproducts of solar energy and of wind energy. What do we do with all these solar panels that have uh, finite lives, and the same with the wind turbines, which have finite lives, and they do not decompose. So, what are we going to do with those when we look at um, an ecosystem where we want to contain those all together and be able to recycle them? I also, though, really want to say is that any new source such as we're putting in, such as even enhanced solar and like that, we have to look at how to integrate that into the infrastructure. One of the big benefits I see is fusion, is that it can be plugged and play. For example, if we shut down an existing coal power plant, which is very polluting, and if we replace it with a fusion power plant, we can drop it in place there. And it can use all the infrastructure and things, and it would be almost a drop in place. In an ideal world where all fossil fuel plants would be placed by fusion plants, and we would trade polluting energy with clean energy without any additional damage to the environment. And if you look at what we do with it, the energy produced in that lifetime could easily offset any of the cost of putting them in there. And we know the grid is going to face challenges with wind and solar due to their variable nature. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you have to have something. And fusion as one of the things that can fill that gap is we're putting there. Like I've also said, I'm also betting on geothermal, and I'm also betting on the future of hydrogen power generation. You've heard me say, as we've talked about electric vehicles before, I believe the electric battery vehicles we have today are a transitional uh, technology until we go to hydrogen powered vehicles of the future. I can see the same thing as we're going through and looking at the future of our energy grids and things, is we're going to be going through different type of technology changes. And once again, I believe we will have a hybrid future made up of multiple ways to generate energy than just one. And fusion has to be part of that equation, I believe, for us to be successful as we generate this in going into the future. Um, it looks like we've lost Sharif, but a lot of opportunities for science, particularly in areas around material science, producing the materials, looking at alternative material sciences that can be used in this. One of the big things that the entire energy system needs is enhanced control systems, the ability to look at how to control this. The others is a lot of material science to improve the transmission process. When you ship electricity from power plants to deliver it, for example, to cities and others, you lose a tremendous amount of the energy just going through the wires. And we need to look at new approaches for doing that. There's some exciting wireless approaches for doing that. I'm still not confident in those as we look at the level of energy we need to transmit through that and what is the safety of those. The other things we're seeing, though, is our whole energy grid is at risk right now from cyber attacks. Uh, just yesterday in the United States, they issued an extreme warning that not only is the energy grid in danger, but what they've noticed is that hackers are now targeting, for example, the network of charging stations for Tesla cars. And they're beginning to produce cyber attacks against those as well. So, security is going to be a big challenge, no matter what technologies we use to generate the energy requirements for the global utilization. And particularly in developing nations, which have infrastructures that maybe not are not as resilient as others, we really have to look at ways to look at the energy production needs and things in those from a systems of systems approach, and how to begin to use those across a global uh, environment. And I think that's probably my concluding remarks. David, do you have anything else to say? Because I see Sharif is still not back.
No, I mean, I think we had covered it as much as we can.
I agree.
You know, if people are into these kinds of things, they should get out and do something, get involved. You know, if a group of high schoolers can build a reactor and get it working and you know, get all these nuclear certifications and all of this kind of stuff, then who's to stop anyone else?
I agree.
I think you know, the field is wide open, and there's only going to be more of it, and that's where the market's going.
I agree with you. And so my advice to people is to really take the time and look at the multitude of sources you have here. And there's places you can experiment, but stay up on this, understanding that as you said, and I said, I think it's going to take a diversity of approaches to be successful in this today. And that I personally believe a hybrid solution will be the future of this as we go forward. And take the time to produce the science. Look at the entrepreneurial activities you can do. Governments need to be involved in understanding that the future energy and the energy grid is in the best interest of advancing their nations and the power of their nations going forward. And Rob, you just joined us as we're doing the wrap up on this. And we've lost Sharif, so we were beginning to shut down in just a moment. I see Sharif is coming back. But
yeah, that's fine. I didn't realize you'd started an hour earlier.
I was surprised as well. But that is the thing there. And Sharif, like I said, I believe that the future of the energy grid will include fusion, but it will be a hybrid solution with things like geothermal, hydrogen, and solar, wind, kinetic power, and others to replace that future. So Sharif, thank you for letting me be part of the show for the last hour. Rob, it looks like he's froze. I might let you go ahead and wrap us up because I'm going to have to jump off for another call.
Yeah, I didn't hear much of what you saw. I was just on for the last five to 10 minutes.
I would say, Rob, you maybe tell us what your opinion is of the future of energy and whether it's nuclear or other renewable energies, or maybe we're going to just do fossil fuels for the next 1,000 years.
Well, I think the transition off of fossil fuels is going to take a while. So like David said, looking forward, it's going to be a blend of energies, energy generation sources. Nuclear and I mean, fusion and fission are two different forms of nuclear generation, with fusion having the advantage of far less waste and far less radiation risk, safety risk. So it's the great hope. The problem, of course, has been getting it to work at scale. Looks like we're very close to that now. So I would expect as soon as fusion becomes viable, and if we get the containment costs down to something a bit more reasonable, then fusion will replace fission as the way to generate nuclear power. And so the existing nuclear power plants would be phased out in favor of new fusion plants. But that would work in sync with wind, solar, geothermal, the other methods of energy generation as we try to wean ourselves off petrochemical sources, which is because we're addicted to them, is going to take a while. And there are a number of countries that their entire economy is selling petrochemical petrochemical. And plastics and a lot of other stuff kind of falls apart when you're not making, we're not turning oil into gas. So it's going to be, we've got a number of interesting economic issues to resolve as we go through the process. But I think David's right that that we're looking at a blend, and that'll be my opening and closing remarks this time.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rob, Professor David J. Kelly, and Professor David Smith for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. This month, we have very special conference with India Soft. People from 199 countries, they will join in this conference. Around 50,000 people will attend in this conference. So hopefully through this process, we can collaborate with more business communities, and definitely this conference will focus on B2B and the software industry. So from this conference, I think that many solutions will come for India and for South Asian community. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye, everyone.
Hi, everyone.